Hi, I'm ESPN boxing reporter Michael Rothstein, along with ESPN boxing insider Mike Coppinger, ESPN boxing reporter Ben Baby, ESPN MMA insider Mark Ramondi. There's a whole bunch of us here because we are here to talk Jake Paul, Anderson Silva. That is coming down Saturday night at the Gila River Arena in Glendale, Arizona. Jake Paul trying to win his sixth fight, maybe knock out his for knocking out for the fifth time. And let's just jump right into this. Mark, you are on site. If people can't see behind you, you were looking exactly like you would be in a hotel room. Mark, how did we get to this point with Jake Paul and Anderson Silva? Walk us down this path for Jake Paul.
Okay, so Jake Paul, I think everyone knows by now, his background is content creation, social media, blew up on Vine, was very famous with him and his brother on YouTube. Both of them kind of parlayed that into a big fight in 2018. Brothers versus brothers. Like it was Logan versus KSI, Jake Paul versus Deji, KSI's brother. To make a long story short, that did very well. And Logan didn't, he fought Floyd Mayweather, but Jake really got the boxing bug. Ended up facing another YouTuber, Anderson Gibb, in 2020. And then later that same year, what really blew him up in boxing was a knockout over former NBA slam dunk champion Nate Robinson. That was, of course, on the Mike Tyson card, the Mike Tyson Roy Jones card that did big numbers. So more fame for Jake Paul in different circles. And then he parlayed that into knocking out Ben Askren last year. Then he beat Tyron Woodley in August 2021, and then he fought Tyron Woodley again last December. Should have been Tommy Fury. Fury pulled out, fought Woodley, and knocked him out pretty impressively in that fight. And now here we are. He's 5-0, and Anderson Silva is one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time. And limited boxing experience. He's 3-1, I think, or 2-1. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about a 5-0 YouTube guy against a 2-1 MMA fighter.
And it might end up being one of the most watched fights this year because that is why we are here. So, Mike, I want to go to you here because obviously you are our boxing expert. Is this the toughest fight you think that Jake Paul has had so
far? I guess probably, although, again, this is a 47-year-old who's not a boxer. And I hear a lot about Anderson Silva's win over Chavez Jr., a man who hasn't trained probably in 5 years and almost beat Silva without training at all. Still, I guess, a good win considering Chavez is a boxer. I don't put too much stock into that performance. I think Jake Paul, should have his way with Silva in this fight. And I think Jake Paul is not really a bad fighter. He's certainly not bad for his level, for his record. He takes it seriously. He trains hard. With all the money he has and all the resources, he has the best training available. So I do think Anderson Silva is probably the best opponent on paper, but that's not saying much.
That is fair, Ben. I mean, I want to bring you in here. You've watched a lot of boxing, obviously, in your career doing this as well. I mean, do you think that this is the best opponent for Jake Paul so far? Or was maybe Tyron Woodley in that conversation because Tyron Woodley at least was, younger?
Yeah, I feel like, right now, I'm like, what have our lives become that we're sitting down talking about Jake Paul fighting Anderson Silva? I feel like Julio Chavez Sr., the meme of him having to watch his son fight in the ring, which we all kind of have that, where he's sitting here going like this, I'm like, what are we doing here?
Yourself, Ben. I'm looking forward to this fight on Saturday. I'm looking forward to this.
I'm not knocking the fight. It's a good fight, Mark. I'm glad you get the points out of this, getting to experience this firsthand. Look at this. I think that this says a lot about what Jake Paul is doing. You talk about best opponent. Every time you look at opponent for Jake Paul, it's a measuring stick of what he's doing commercially. And you talk about a guy like Anderson Silva, an absolute legend in MMA and UFC. He's a guy that casual sports fans know, even if they don't follow combat sports. And the fact that this kind of guy is getting in the ring with Jake Paul says volumes about it. Jake Paul has done a good job of matchmaking up until this point. I think, a lot of prize fighting is making sure that, you find an opponent who's suitable for you and is commercially viable. And like Cop said, I do think that Jake Paul should have no problems with Anderson Silva. Quite frankly, when you look at the matchmaking up until this point, they haven't found a guy who has given Jake Paul a lot of problems. You know, there's plenty of boxers you could find, and the fact they find Anderson Silva says volumes kind of about what this event is going to be. It's going to be entertaining. It's going to showcase some of the skills that Jake Paul has built over his time in combat. But, you know, there's a reason we're talking about all of this. I think that this is a very good opponent for what Jake Paul is doing at this point in his career.
Well, Ben, that's interesting for me because I actually think that there's a chance Anderson Silva can actually win this fight because he's actually at least been in a ring before. And
well, that's the point. That's the point. You want a guy you think maybe this could be the guy who beat Jake Paul, maybe. And then what happens? Jake Paul goes out, does his thing, and then we say, all right, well, who's next? And then the whole thing self-perpetuates. I mean, we can talk about this for a while. It's really fascinating because Jake Paul is showing everybody else in boxing how to do boxing.
One thing I want to say is, I think Jake Paul and his team with Nakisa Badarian, they do a really good job. If they're picking the opponent, they're picking him for a reason. And that's not a slight. That's no different than any smart boxing manager or smart MMA manager, especially when you have somebody in Jake Paul who's inexperienced and is obviously a cash cow. You're not purposely picking guys that you think are going to lose to. That's number one. Number two is Jake Paul is certainly fighting really strong competition for just being 5-0. I mean, you don't see pro boxers fighting tough competition at 5-0. You're fighting, you know, guys certainly well below Anderson Silva. So I don't want to give Jake Paul, I don't want to criticize Jake Paul for his level of opposition. It's just that when you're fighting these high level events, that's when you start, magnifying it and saying, okay, well, is this a big time fight? No, it's not a big time fight, but it is a big event.
Right, which is where I want to go with this next. What is Jake Paul's true potential? I'll just open this up. What do you feel like his true potential is in boxing?
Wow. Okay. I mean, I'll start. I mean, I don't think it really matters all that much. And what I mean by that is, what kind of potential are we talking about? Do we think that Jake Paul is going to be a world champion? I don't think that's ever going to happen. But if we're talking about from a business perspective, the potential we've already seen, it's there. There are big fights out there that he's already done. There are probably big fights for him in the future. Maybe a fight with Nate Diaz. I think that wins and losses do matter a little bit in his career, but I look at it a little bit like pro wrestling, to be honest with you. Wins and losses matter to an extent, but it's really more about the storylines. It's more about the star power. It's about how you can sell it. And I'm glad that Cobb brought up Jake Paul's business manager, Nakisa Badarian, who also co-founded Paul's Most Valuable Promotions promotional company, former CFO of the UFC. So he has someone who knows the fighting game as far as the numbers as good as anyone there is. He's part of the team that sold the UFC to Endeavor a few years ago. So they certainly have the business thing figured out pretty well, it seems.
Here's my thing, right? Like with Jake Paul, if Jake Paul loses, I actually feel like that next fight would actually do better for him because all of a sudden people who don't want to tune in because they don't necessarily think Jake Paul will ever put himself in a position to get beat or knocked out would all of a sudden be like, oh, wow, I might actually get to see Jake Paul get knocked out now. And that was, if you think about it, a year and a half ago, that's part of why so many of his pay-per-views initially did well because people wanted to see Jake Paul get knocked out. Like that was half of it, right? Especially with Tyron Woodley.
Well, yeah, it's the Floyd Mayweather model, right? You have half the people watching you to watch you win and half the people want to see you get knocked out. But the problem is the first time you actually get knocked out, then those other half don't want to see you get knocked out the second time, really. The novelty wears off. And that's the thing. These are novelty fights. At some point, people are going to lose interest. Although, I don't think we're there yet. And if Jake Paul is going to fight Nate Diaz, like Mark said, that's a huge fight. There are a lot of big fights out there for him. I think he's starting to get past the point of these Tommy Fury type fights. And Tommy Fury is a real boxer, and Jake Paul did try to fight him. But I think, in my opinion, we're getting to the end of these novelty fights, so to speak, I think. Whereas Jake's going to have to probably fight somebody like an Nate Diaz.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that when you look at what you see with his career model, Cobb, you hit it right on the money. I mean, I wrote about this, I believe, when Logan Paul fought Floyd Mayweather. You know, the Paul brothers, so we've seen so many boxers.
By the way, Logan Paul fought Floyd Mayweather.
Correct, fought. I think that's a very, very good distinction there. We've seen so many pro boxers try to mimic that Mayweather model. They want to be polarizing. They want to get people to tune in. And it just hasn't really worked. Nobody's really done it as well as the Paul brothers. I mean, you look at what they've done. I mean, they have been personalities that have been polarizing from the time that they were on Vine up until what they're currently doing. And they've mastered that playbook. You talk to people inside boxing. There's a reason that boxing people have gotten involved. There's a reason Anderson Silva has gotten involved, because these are big time events, and boxing diehards can complain about, oh, what is this doing to the sport or whatever. I mean, listen, he's putting on major events, and boxing in 2022 hasn't been able to deliver those kind of events. I mean, we're all, established quote unquote combat media talking about the big event that's occurring. I mean, this is what Jake Paul is producing. And I agree with you. At some point, you're going to have to find a level of opponent to either continue this kind of sustain what's going on, or find, he's got to maybe fight a real boxer. At some point, people are going to get fed up with these novelty fights. But, like Mark said, it doesn't have to be a championship fight. It just has to maintain the level of interest. And, we'll see what happens if and when he loses. But I think Jake has done a really good job, and the Paul brothers in general, over the last decade, of sustaining interest, across multiple mediums, across multiple platforms. I'm not sleeping on them able to figure this out if and when he does eventually lose.
Right. And by the way, Mark Romani before earlier said Jake Paul doesn't have championship potential. And while I agree with you, Mark, let's not look past the sanctioning body and their greed. I am sure they could find a way to get a title around the waist of Jake Paul, and I'm sure Mauricio Sulaiman is going to get to it right away.
Well, I did say world champion. I didn't just say any championship. I said world champion. And look, if that ends up happening one day, I'll happily eat my words. It just seems very far in the future.
Yeah, who's to say we're not going to have a WBC influencer belt here in a couple of years? I mean, I can just smell the sanctioning fees. I can see the belts, maybe a nice little like holographic thing. Like, the possibilities are endless. I can see us getting Jake Paul a championship belt.
The eventual Jake Paul KSI fight, and it will happen at some point, whether or not it happens next.
I can't wait for that one.
That's going to be a massive fight. It's going to be huge. It's going to be huge. I don't know a thing about KSI. I could not tell you a thing about the guy, but I know it's going to be a big fight if it happens. When it happens.
The wild thing is, if that happens next year, it might end up being one of the 5 biggest fights, which is again part of why we're here talking about Jake Paul Anderson Silva, which is happening this Saturday. So if Jake Paul wins, which we've talked about here, where should he turn next? Is it Nate Diaz? Is it maybe trying to figure out if he can fight someone on the level of like a Hasim Rahman Jr., which was supposed to happen back in August at the Garden? Or is it, maybe just go be a promoter, because why not?
I mean, look, I hope and pray that we're all building toward the one big fight, and we all know what it is: Jake Paul and Conor McGregor. That is the money fight by far, and I don't know what Conor McGregor's status is right now with UFC, but that fight has to happen at some point if Jake Paul is going to keep doing this and keep winning, keep fighting UFC fighters. Because I don't even know how much money they make on that one, and I don't even know who wins. It's actually kind of an interesting fight to me. Short of Conor McGregor,
McGregor Cop has either 2 or 3 fights left on his contract, depending on who you ask.
That's perfect. By that point, he's a little more washed up, and then Jake Paul is ready. Jake Paul's a little more developed in his game by then. Seems like the perfect timing for him.
And listen, if there's anything we've learned in boxing, we just need the idea of the fight to happen. Hell, we could have Conor McGregor fighting Jake Paul before we get Errol Spence and Bud Crawford in the ring. I mean, come on now, Cop. You already know how long this thing can drag out. I mean, seriously though, you just plant the idea that maybe this thing could happen. And as we've learned in boxing, fans might wait 5 or 6 years, and then maybe this thing occurs. I mean, you just have to dangle the carrot long enough and it become an actual thing. But I think that, we look at every time that one of these things happen, it becomes like a big referendum on the sport and kind of what happens next. And like I said, I think that if you're a promoter, if you're at Top Rank, you're at Golden Boy, you're at Matchroom, you're somehow involved in making the business of boxing happen, you need to go out, go get the pay-per-view, get a notepad, and figure out why this thing works. And before anybody wants to complain about this, let's just go ahead and set this clear. Jake Paul has been very, very good for boxing because he's doing for the sport what promoters have not been able to do in 2022, and that give people something they actually want to watch, make a fight that actually people care about, and bring it to fruition. So, we're going to hear a lot of chatter leading up to this, and I want to make sure we address this because I think boxing fans right now, as we all know, are sick of seeing a lot of these good fights that theoretically should happen that cannot be made for whatever reason. And so thank goodness we at least have something as trivial as a Jake Paul fighting Anderson Silva. While it is a lot of fun, there's a lot of we've all seen the dancing clip, whatever it is. The fact of the matter is, yeah, I know that but those dancing skills.
What a weird way to sell a fight. Let's have them dance. That I do not understand.
I loved it. I loved every part of that.
I want to see you guys fight each other.
Oh, yeah, exactly. All of that being said, we still can't put our minds around it, but it still is doing a lot better for the sport than the sport's doing for itself. And I think that's something we really have to point out. And, boxing, I think that they do need to figure out and take some cues on why this is working and eventually say, you know what, this is what our sport is going to become if we can't put actual good fights together.
Well, that's part of this, right? Like, Jake Paul got more legitimacy in boxing the second Amanda Serrano signed with him about 18 months ago. And then he went out and he made Amanda Serrano money. Made Amanda Serrano money on his cards, and then made Amanda Serrano money by getting her to fight Katie Taylor in Madison Square Garden in April. That is what really legitimized Jake Paul. And Jake Paul, by the way, when I talked to him back in March in Puerto Rico for an Amanda Serrano story, completely admitted that. He was like, without Amanda Serrano, I don't know if I'm able to do some of what I'm doing in terms of the boxing space, because she believed in me and she believed in what we were trying to do, meaning him and Nikisa Bidarian, who we've been talking about. So that, I think, has really pushed this forward in terms of a promotional situation for him. And honestly, probably also gave him some legitimacy as a boxer, because they have trained together here and there in Puerto Rico, which, Ben, leads me to this. And I want to start with you, Cop. Is Jake Paul good for boxing?
I think he is good for boxing. I think it brings eyeballs to the sport, and whether those fans stick around or not, he's certainly not bad for boxing. You can't argue that he's bad for it. What's bad for boxing, like Ben said, is not being able to deliver Crawford Spence, not being able to deliver Fury Joshua, or Javante versus Ryan Garcia. That's the problem with boxing. I mean, boxing could be one of the biggest sports in the world if the best just fought the best. There's a number of issues: too many titles, too many weight classes. But Jake Paul is not one of the issues with boxing.
I would agree. I would agree with what Cop said, and I always go back to seeing the crowds in Cleveland and in Tampa last year. And what I mean by that is, I've covered combat sports for a long time, 10 years, and I've never seen a younger crowd. I've never seen young teenagers at fights. They don't come to UFC fights like that. They don't even know if they're allowed to. Might be 21 and over. They don't go to boxing matches like that. But I saw kids with their parents. I saw 13-year-old kids, 15-year-old kids. That was a big part of the audience at those fights. And how could that not be good for boxing? Just to expose those younger people, that younger demographic. The demographic is aging in all sports. Exposing those young people can't be a bad thing. I don't see how it's a bad thing at all.
Well, Mark, it's interesting you bring that up, because I was with you at Amalie Arena in Tampa for that second Jake Paul Tyron Woodley fight. And the thing that stuck out to me, and it's why I actually believe, one of the reasons I believe Jake Paul is really good for the sport, is we've all been to combat sports events. It's empty at the start of the event. Like the call time, 7:30, whatever undercard, you got like 30 people in the arena, and it's like family and trainers and other fighters. Amalie Arena was like 3/4 full in December when Jake Paul fought. Like, it was like packed. You're like, okay, they're expecting a full show, which again, I think goes to the fact that it's a new audience, an audience that is used to, hey, this is a sporting event that says it's a 7:30 start time. I'm going to see action starting at 7:30, which boxing has never believed in for whatever reason. And I think that has really helped as well. And I was at Taylor Serrano in April, and you saw because some of that crowd is carried over from Jake Paul because of Amanda Serrano, and that has really blown up her career in a good way. And you saw similar things there, where all of a sudden, like by the third, fourth fight of the night, the garden was half full. And you just never see that in boxing. I'd be curious to see, Mark, what that looks like on Saturday. But Ben, I'll toss this to you, because you started all this with, is Jake Paul good for boxing? Is that part of where you think boxing needs to take notes and just say, hey, all right, you have to find a way to not only put on the fights, but get people in the door earlier?
Yeah, I mean, how much time do we got, Rothstein? I mean, we got an hour, we got 2 hours, we got a week. I mean, I feel like we could go for as long as you possibly want on what boxing is not getting right. And so I think when you talk about building good pay-per-view cards. I mean, how many times in the last year and 2 years, especially post-pandemic, have we watched a card where the undercard is completely atrocious, not worth turning into? You know, you get to a main event, it's not even competitive. The odds aren't great. You know, you see the crowd, there's just no buzz. You know, like Mark said, you know, for Jake Paul fights, wherever it is, there is a certain buzz, a certain feeling that you get. You feel like even if it's not a big name and you know, you're like, okay, it feels a little bit like an exhibition, there's a certain buzz, there's an electricity that you get. And that feeling, listen, I was at the Super Bowl in February, and, you know, I've been at some of these big fights. And when you're at, you know, a Canelo fight, when you're seeing Errol Spence fight in Dallas, when you're at a big time event, and you guys know this, there's a certain buzz that even events like the Super Bowl, they do not produce. And I know that's crazy to a lot of people, but until you're ringside, I know for Taylor Serrano, it had to have felt that way inside the Garden. And I think Jake Paul, for whatever you want to think about it, he brings that kind of buzz, not just to the arena on fight night, but on social media to, you know, advertising executives. And there's a reason a lot of people want to get involved. There's a reason that Triller was involved first, then it went into Showtime. And then they decided that we're going to go do this thing. And there's a reason this has been really successful. It's been really lucrative. And boxing needs to figure out what it is not doing well. And if there are so many times in boxing, you know, I feel like, you know, it's one of these industries where they're just looking to, it feels like they're just almost trying to hang on. And we've seen that be a criticism. They're not looking on how to make money. You know, they're trying to marinate fights too long. They're trying to find excuses on, oh, what network? You know, we're seeing this right now with the Gervonta Davis and Ryan Garcia negotiations. We're seeing this with the Errol Spence and Bud Crawford. You know, we'll see what happens, you know, down the line with Tyson Fury and Alexander Usyk. Everyone's looking for excuses on why, you know, everything has to be just right. Why not just go ahead and figure out how we can do this? How can we make more money? And what's in the best business for everybody? You know, hopefully with how well this does, you know, we'll see how it all comes to fruition on fight night. But there are just so many things that boxing can learn from and what it is not doing well. And it needs to be realistic about what is not working. Because right now in the sport, like Cop talked about earlier, and like we've discussed at length, there's a lot of things that aren't going right.
No, absolutely. And by the way, like you mentioned the undercards, Le'Veon Bell fighting on this undercard, making his pro debut against Uriah Hall. Le'Veon Bell, former NFL running back. Shadasia Green, a really interesting super middleweight fighter on the women's side of things that could maybe one day be an opponent for Clarissa Shields. And Ashton Sylvie, who is the third fighter currently signed to Most Valuable Promotions. Amanda Serrano, by the way, not fighting on this card. Guys, I want to quickly wrap it around.
Don't forget. We talked about this earlier. There is a reason why Team Nate Diaz's Chris Avila is on this card against Mikhail Dr. Mike Varshavsky, the YouTube doctor, famous, over 10 million subscribers on YouTube. So
I'm
Nate Diaz and his
hearing
entire...
for the first time.
What was that, Cup?
I've never heard of this guy. Yeah, but apparently
I can't say I've heard of him either, but it's pretty clear what they're doing, right? This is the second time that Chris Avila from Nate Diaz's team has fought on a Jake Paul undercard. I'm curious to see how much this week they play up that idea that maybe Nate and Jake could fight in the future.
That, Mark, that's leading me exactly where I want to go, because I want to quickly whip around. Final thoughts from each of you. Mark, we'll start with you. Final thoughts and maybe a prediction on what you think happens, at least in the main event on Saturday night.
Just really interesting to see what that even looks like. I think that's part of the allure of these Jake Paul fights. We just don't have an idea of what they may look like because of Jake, his lack of experience, and the opponents. And personally, as a guy who covers the MMA, I don't want to leave out Anderson Silva. He's 47 years old. He had a Hall of Fame career. He's not in there yet. He should be going in there soon. He had a Hall of Fame career in the UFC, one of the best of all time. And where does he go after this? What does he do? Is this just a paycheck for him? Does he go out and does he, whip Jake Paul's butt? I have no idea. And that's what I'm curious to see. Where does Silva go? Where does Jake Paul go? And what does it even look like?
First off, Anderson Silva, I would hope he's going to retirement after all the money he's making this weekend, I'm assuming. And he's 47 years old. Look, he's still in great shape at 47. I know 47 for everyone is not the same, obviously. He looks like he's in great shape, and he is a legendary MMA fighter. I want to make one thing clear. Boxing stances and MMA stances, even when striking, are completely different. There's not a lot of crossover. Obviously, you still need to know how to throw punches properly and defend yourself. But the stance is changing and all that, the gloves. It's a lot of differences. I'm going to go Jake Paul by knockout late. I think Silva will give him some issues early. Jake's a much naturally stronger guy. He's much younger. And Jake does take boxing seriously. And again, like I said, there's a reason they're picking Anderson Silva. So if they know what they're doing, and I think they do, I'm going to go Jake Paul by knockout. And I think after that, hopefully we see that Nate Diaz fight.
Yeah, what Cop just mentioned, I think everything hits home when you look at how Jake Paul has dedicated himself to the sport. You have to applaud him for that. He's younger. He is a big guy. And when you look at how well he has, developed over the last few years, I mean, Jake looks vastly different than he did when he started these fights. And I think that, like Cop said, there isn't a lot of carryover or crossover, between the two disciplines. Boxing, you watch MMA stand up, it is vastly different from doing pure boxing, when that's all you do. I like Jake in a knockout as well. I think Anderson Silva is going to get a well-deserved payday, get the money that he deserves for an illustrious career. And we'll see what happens next with Jake. But whatever it is, I'm sure we're going to be talking about it, and that's going to build that buzz going into that next fight.
No, there's no doubt. I'm going to wrap that up by saying I also think Jake Paul wins. I think Jake Paul wins by knockout. I'm going to actually go with knockout in the 6th, similar to what he did against Tyron Woodley. I think he'll take a couple rounds, figure Anderson Silva out, because Jake Paul, the one thing that I've noticed with him is he has gotten better each fight, and he is growing. And again, he doesn't have an amateur career either. And that's part of this too, as Cop alluded to earlier. 6 fights in, he's fighting better competition than almost any, especially upper weight person, has really fought in the past in terms of experience in combat sports on a high level. I like Jake Paul in this situation. Knockout in 6. Of course, we will see what happens. Mark will be there at Gila River Arena in Glendale, Arizona. For Ben Baby, Mike Coppinger, Mark Raimondi, I'm ESPN boxing reporter Michael Rothstein, and we will see you at the fights.
Thank you for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.